Welcome to Castle Howard. It's a fine spring day, and normally Castle Howard would be full of visitors, either enjoying the grounds or going round the house inside. Sadly, that isn't possible today. So instead, I'm going to introduce you to parts of the collection and their history by way of a virtual grand tour. And I say grand tour because surrounding me at the bottom of the staircase here are examples of Roman antiquities collected by the Fourth Earl of Carlisle on his grand tour to Italy in 1738-39. Now, the grand tour was a cultural expedition undertaken mostly by young men, often in the company of a tutor, and the aim was to immerse oneself in the culture of Europe, especially Italy, where you would study its history, its architecture, and its works of art. The 18th century was enthralled to the classical world as well as the Renaissance. And these grand tours would often turn into collecting expeditions, as wealthy young aristocrats would ship home sculpture and paintings with which to fill their grand mansions in England. And Castle Howard is no exception. 3 generations of the family have filled it with Old Master paintings, Roman antiquities, and 18th century paintings. We're now at the top of the grand staircase, and as you ascend the steps, you become aware of a gallery of family portraits. These are members of the Howard family, the Earls of Carlisle. And the 3 key figures for this story are the 3rd, the 4th, and the 5th Earls. The 3rd Earl behind me is the man responsible for building Castle Howard, begun in 1699 with his 2 architects, Sir John Vanbrugh and Nicholas Hawksmoor. Now, he had travelled to Italy at the end of the 1680s, but he had made very few purchases. What he really returned with was a head full of ideas and architectural possibilities. His son, the 4th Earl, made 2 expeditions to Italy in 1715 and again at the end of the 1730s. And he was a major collector and a connoisseur, acquiring Roman antiquities, gems, medallions, bronzes, other sculptures, and paintings by contemporary Italian artists. And in turn, his son, the 5th Earl of Carlisle, made his grand tour to Italy in 1768, where he purchased paintings and sculpture. It was a practice that he continued back in England, buying regularly at the London sale rooms and through dealers. And in the 1790s, he was responsible for acquiring the Orleans collection of Italian paintings, spirited away from revolutionary turmoil in France to go on exhibition and sale in London. So 3 important collectors who filled Castle Howard with the fruits of their grand tours. But in addition to looking at their history, I also want to consider another dimension to these objects. What it means to look at paintings and sculptures such as these in this context. The story of Castle Howard and its collections begins with Charles Howard, the 3rd Earl of Carlisle, born in 1668. At the end of the 1680s, he journeyed through Holland and Germany to Italy, where he visited Venice, Padua, and Rome, noting down observations in his commonplace book. And these included notes about artists, but also with an eye to his social agenda, he listed all the important noble families of Italy. So we see on the left-hand side of the screen, in the top paragraph, how Charles or Carlo Maratti is considered the most famous painter of Europe, as well as Luca Giordano down in Naples. There's a little few remarks here on how Naples is governed, some remarks on French cardinals, and then a rather quaint spelling for the Duke or Duck of Florence and his estimated wealth. And on the right-hand side, we see him listing the best families in Venice, in Rome, and in Naples. So these are priceless little manuscript notes that would assist him during his travels. But by the late 1690s, after his return to England, the third Earl was thinking of settling down, and he decided to build himself a palace in this corner of Yorkshire. And with this, we come to a pivotal point about the history of travel in the Howard family. Their voyages were not simply physical expeditions over land and across sea. Their travels were also about the exposure to new cultures, the adoption of new ideas, and the collecting of treasures. Each expedition was as much a cultural and mental progress as well as a journey on horseback or in a carriage. What you saw on your travels mattered, but arguably what you brought back in the way of new influences mattered even more. And the third Earl certainly acquired a taste for the Italianate from his time in Europe. And in this second portrait of him by William Aikman in 1728, he's shown standing in front of his new home, Castle Howard, captured in a theatrical gesture as he lowers his coronet to reveal the grand building behind. Of course, building a house like Castle Howard was one thing, but furnishing it another. Inside the building, Carlisle made the most of his opportunity for extending his patronage, employing some of the finest craftsmen of the day. In the Great Hall, rising dramatically into the air, are frescoes painted by the Venetian artist Antonio Pellegrini, who had been brought to England by the Duke of Manchester in 1708. Pellegrini's designs included the 4 elements in the pendentives and the 12 figures of the zodiac on the ceilings above the staircases. And this ethereal world climaxes 70 feet up with the Fall of Phaeton. Encouraged to look higher and higher, the viewer finally meets the dizzying spectacle of Apollo's sun plunging to Earth. Pellegrini's work represents some of the largest and most dramatic decorative work in the house. But the beginnings of the picture collection lie with his fellow countryman, Marco Ricci, who between 1709 and 1711 was commissioned to paint a series of over 40 canvases to hang throughout the house, filling the building with sublime landscapes and rustic scenes. And these will have recalled the Earl's visit to Italy 30 years earlier. Because many of these were fixtures, such as over-door or over-mantelpieces, they were, alas, lost in the blaze of 1940. Others survived, and after lying in store for half a century, were restored and put back on show in the 1990s. The second generation of collecting began when the young Henry Howard, the future 4th Earl, visited Italy in 1714 to 15. And this trip evidently kindled his enthusiasm for Roman antiquities. He returned from his grand tour steeped in the art and architecture of Italy. And in the early 1720s, he put this knowledge to practical effect when discussing with his father and Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor the designs for buildings in the gardens at Castle Howard. And the inspiration for these structures will have come from either first-hand knowledge or familiarity through books and engravings. So, for example, Palladio's famous Villa Rotunda on the bottom right was clearly the model for Vanbragh's Temple of the Four Winds. And Roman inspiration was also behind Vanbragh's choice of an obelisk in 1714. The 2 pyramids, built by Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor respectively, drew from similar sources. Vanbragh's Pyramid Arch of 1719 was influenced by the Albano Gate, which had appeared in John Evelyn's translation of a French architectural treatise in the 1660s. And Hawksmoor's large pyramid of a decade later was modelled on the monument to Caius Cestius in Rome. And it's important to remember that neither architect had travelled to Italy. Their knowledge of these structures was second-hand. Similarly, the tomb of Cecilia Metella in the centre of the picture here, as well as Bramante's Tempietto at the bottom right, helped inform
the final design of Hawksmoor's mausoleum. But in fact, the idea for a freestanding mausoleum, not attached to a house or a chapel, derived from Vanbragh's memories of the European cemetery at Surat, when he had been an East India Company trader in the 1680s. These structures had stayed in his mind, and 30 years after his time in India, he was able to reproduce them in a small drawing. In the course of the first 3 decades of the 18th century, father and son had supplemented their first-hand knowledge of Italy with a scholarly understanding of Roman and Italian architecture through books and drawings, and aided and abetted by their architects.
In 1738-39, just after the death of his father, when the Fourth Earl inherited the title, he travelled to Italy for a second time. And from this moment can be dated a huge influx of artworks, which really determined the character of Castle Howard for the next century at least. And his greatest contribution lay in assembling the antique sculptures that you can see behind me, most of which on display in the antique passage and the great hall beyond.
As was common practice, the Earl availed himself of the services of various agents or dealers in Rome, such as Francesco di Ficcorini, seen in the centre of this caricature by Pierleone Ghezzi. The Fourth Earl's correspondence with these figures reveals much about the practicalities of collecting. His middlemen would negotiate assiduously on his behalf for statues, busts, coins, intaglios, drawings, ivories, bronzes, mosaics, and urns. And an account of January 1741 from Ficcorini, totaling more than 1,500 scudi, details the costs of restoration, packing, shipping, duty, and of course, the objects themselves. And 3 items from this consignment can be identified at Castle Howard today. An alabaster draped bust of a figure referred to as Poppaea. A head of Silenus, a 2nd century AD bust, and a reclining figure of a river god. Much of Ficcorini's correspondence discussed the restoration of various pieces, and a letter of 1745 discusses Carlisle's offer of 150 scudi for a bust of Antoninus Pius. Ficcorini claimed that this was too low. The owner would accept no less than 200 scudi. These negotiations for the Antoninus figure dragged on until, in another letter, Ficcorini declared it was no use continuing with the transaction. However, it's likely that some agreement was eventually reached between Carlisle, Ficcorini, and the unidentified owner, since there are 2 busts of Antoninus Pius in the collection at Castle Howard, one on the left of the 2nd century and one on the right, a later version, probably from the 16th century. And another of Carlisle's agents, Belisario Amedei, offered him a bust of Faustina, the wife of Antoninus Pius, a 2nd century piece with a badly damaged face. He also offered a fine statue of Bacchus, which stands today in the Scagliola niche in the Great Hall, and also a 1st century mosaic panel depicting Galatea pulled across the sea by 2 dolphins. When in Italy, the Earl will have mixed with like-minded connoisseurs, as in this typical view of a group of aristocratic grand tourists attributed to John Russell. Often, noblemen would choose to have their portrait painted against the backdrop of Rome, Florence, or wherever, and their pose would often be that of a studious and elegant figure, and in some cases, they might even be depicted making sketches, as in this example on the right, a picture from the end of the 18th century of Dr. Penrose by Louis Gouffier. Penrose's pose is also a reminder that in a pre-photographic age, the only way to capture what you saw was to make sketches or by paintings and engravings, although in some instances, grand tourists took their own artist or draftsman along with them. Beyond these studied poses, it's not hard to envisage these wealthy noblemen and their proxies scouring excavations in Italy and haggling for pieces of the highest quality. These depictions from a little later in the century give a good sense of how excavations were witnessed and purchases made on site. The fourth Earl will have visited just such sites at villas and palaces. And of course, the uncovering of Pompeii in 1765 led to a flood of antiquities on the market. And it's very likely he will have met and negotiated with dealers, as in this watercolour example on the right by Henry Tresham, of grand tourists purchasing antiquities in 1795. The fourth Earl had both a trained eye and the services of astute and honest agents, and he assembled a large library to assist him in these pursuits. Consequently, his collection was of an astonishing quality. However, purchasing all these antiquities was one thing, shipping them back to England was another. The letters from his agents express worries about hiding the items from zealous customs officials and anxieties that the shipment back to England might be intercepted by pirates after leaving port, usually Genoa or Livorno, or lost at sea in a storm. Nevertheless, all these sculptural goodies arrived in England in 1740 or so, safe and sound. And on the bottom right, we see a bill of loading for the Golden Eagle. And at the bottom, in faint writing, we'll see our 4 cases containing an alabaster urn and several marble busts directed to the Earl of Carlisle, initially to his London address. But the fourth Earl was also a devotee of Italian painting, and he augmented the flavour of ancient Rome by commissioning a set of 6 capriccio views of Roman ruins from the artist Paolo Panini.
We're now in the north end of the Long Gallery, in front of the stupendous 6 Panini capriccios commissioned by the fourth Earl during that second expedition to Italy. They were executed in 1741, but it was another 2 years before they reached Castle Howard. Now, capriccios are fantasy paintings, and here Panini has assembled the great monuments and sites of Rome into composite views. The buildings do not really sit alongside one another in the way that they are depicted in these pictures. They're a bit like the composite postcard that you can buy with multiple views of a city. But they're much more sophisticated than that, because not least of all, they're a eulogy to the classical world. Now they're filled with all the features that any self-respecting grand tourist or connoisseur would expect to see. In this view, we see the Colosseum, for example. Beyond here, the baths of Caracalla. But like the Bellotto paintings, they're filled with tiny detail, not just architectural features, but figures, from beggars to locals to tourists. Let's have a look at a little more detail.
In this view of the baths of Caracalla, we can see typical groupings of men and women in animated poses, in conversation, gesturing to their surroundings. On the top right, you'll see 2 women accompanied by a dog, and an old soldier is seated in front of them, gesturing to a man beside him. In the background, just visible in the detail on the lower right, you can see a water carrier with 2 pails balanced on a pole across his shoulder. The grandeur of the architecture is juxtaposed with everyday life. In this second view, on the right side of the arcade is a large figure, the Farnese Hercules. But such is the complementary nature of the collections across generations of the family that in fact 2 other versions of this famous statue exist at Castle Howard. There is a lead copy in the gardens purchased by the 3rd Earl in 1723, and a small 16th century bronze version acquired by the Fourth Earl. Traditionally, the Grand Tour was seen as a mixture of education and pleasure. For some young aristocrats, pleasure prevailed at the expense of learning. Others were more dutiful. The principal destination was Rome, a place for serious study and such masculine pursuits as antiquarianism and connoisseurship. Here was the seat of early Western civilization, filled with monuments to a splendid past. From a distance, the city beckoned, its grand monuments punctuating the skyline. On arrival, the young tourist would secure lodgings, garner local knowledge, and engage guides. And from here, one would tour the city on foot or by carriage and visit the compulsory sites. So, for example, on the top left here, St. Peter's in an engraving by Piranesi. But tourists would also congregate with fellow travellers to visit churches, museums, or as in this example on the right, villas and gardens. And this is the Villa Castel Pucci outside Florence. By contrast, Venice, La Serenissima, was a more relaxing destination. It was a place of pageants and processions with life revolving around the lagoon, where there was always a swarm of vessels. Social pleasures would include banquets, operas, and masked balls or ridotto. Here was a city devoted to revelry and the thrill of disguised identity. And many of these moments were captured by the Venetian artist Pietro Longhi in his scenes from everyday life among elite society. And while it would be too simplistic to say that the difference between Rome and Venice was that of study and play, there's no doubt that Venice exercised a powerful and feminine appeal to the male tourist.
The Fourth Earl's pleasure in Venice was arguably greater than his interest in Rome. We're here in the Crimson Dining Room, and on the walls here are 3 views of Venice. They're all that remain of a large collection of Venetian view paintings that once numbered 40. Some of these were sold at the end of the 19th century, some were tragically lost in the fire of 1940, and then in 1944 the trustees sold the rump of the collection in auction, firmly believing that Castle Howard would never be lived in again as a family home. These paintings were all collected by the Fourth Earl from the late 1730s, early 1740s. And old inventories attributed them all to the great master Canaletto. But recent scholarship has identified them to be by Canaletto, by his equally talented nephew Bernardo Bellotto, and their younger contemporary Michele Marieschi. So on the left here we have a view of the Piazzetta San Marco, a little square between St. Mark's and the water's edge. And it's filled with a cluster of people in the centre, and they're watching a puppet show, a subject that Bellotto would use more than once in his paintings. Here in the centre is a large composition known as the Bucintoro leaving the Molo on Ascension Day. It depicts the annual ceremony when the Doge of Venice would be rowed out in the big barge, the Bucintoro, into the lagoon where he would celebrate the symbolic marriage with the sea and cast a gold ring into the waters. And it's a typical set piece. Crowded people at the ceremony and a flotilla of gondolas in the foreground. The third picture is a view of the Campo San Stefano, and this is my favourite picture in the whole of Castle Howard. The building was on fire. This is the painting I would dash in to rescue from the flames. And that might seem a bit odd, because here is a Venetian view without any water. There's not a canal to be seen. Well, the Campo San Stefano is a long, narrow square. It's a thoroughfare, really, on the way to the Accademia Bridge. And typically, it's lined with palazzi and churches. But I love it because it's largely an empty scene with just a few clusters of people there. And it's largely recognisable today from the painting. Okay, the chimneys are not present on the roofs anymore, and in fact there's a 19th century statue in the middle of the campo, but it is largely unchanged. It's a pleasant spot in which to sit, have a coffee and watch the world go by. And unlike many places in Venice, it's not a hot spot full of big crowds of people. Now, as I'm unlikely to be jumping on a plane in the near future, this really is the next best thing. To stand in front of a painting of the Campo San Stefano and allow myself to be transported there.
The fourth Earl seems to have been among the earliest collectors of Marieschi's works. Some 18 view pictures by him were once in the collection. And it's clear that he collected Marieschi not simply because he was less expensive than Canaletto, nor because he was fooled into buying Marieschi pictures as views by Canaletto. The quality and finish of his pictures was very high, and evidently the Earl recognized this. And typically, he also invested in a volume of engravings of Marieschi views. By the end of the 19th century, many of these paintings by Canaletto, Bellotto, and Marieschi had been assembled in a single room known as the Canaletto Room. But today, only 3 paintings from this Venetian collection remain. However, beneath the elegant social surface of these images, there lurked both moral and physical hazards, not only in Venice, but throughout one's tour. It seems likely that the temptations on offer in Venice led to the fourth Earl's son, the young Lord Morpeth, returning to England with what was reported as a venereal distemper. He remained ill for 2 years before dying in 1741. But for all travellers, ill health was an occupational risk. Dirty inns, poor sanitation, bad food, gastric ailments, plague and fevers including malaria were all potential dangers. Few travellers made a tour without being stricken by something. But robbery too was another danger. One family member was robbed overnight in Genoa in 1729, when thieves entered the bedchamber without waking their victims. Other travellers might be waylaid by bandits on remote roads in lawless parts of the country. But none of these hazards deterred generations of Howards from journeying through Europe to Italy. The next chapter in this particular story lies with the third generation of travellers and collectors, the fifth Earl, who was responsible for adding enormously to the collection of paintings, as well as finishing the building of Castle Howard. 1767, he set out on his grand tour, travelling through France, down to Nice and Antibes, and then on to Turin, before venturing further south. His letters talk of his anxiety at crossing the Alps in December. He feared the cold weather, the altitude, and the treacherous mountain passes. His tour was a grand shopping expedition, and his notebooks list all of his purchases of paintings and sculpture, often marking down where he bought items from and how much he had paid for them. In 1768, he purchased a plaster copy of the famous Dying Gladiator from the English banker Thomas Jenkins in Rome. And here is the bill showing you the price for the Fighting Gladiator alongside a few paintings. But what is so interesting about this acquisition is how the Earl would have long been familiar with this figure, since it was depicted in one of the Panini Capritrios, commissioned by his father some 30 years earlier. Growing up at Castle Howard with such splendid treasures on display would have been an educational experience in itself. In one sense, he would have been encountering familiar sights on his tour, having seen and studied them secondhand in paintings as well as books and prints in England. Strangely, the fifth Earl's letters back to England do not talk greatly about works of art. They are a mixture of gossip, reports on his health, and regular accounts of his faithful travelling companion, Rover, his dog, as seen in Reynolds's famous portrait of the Earl. Now, Rover was possibly something like a German Spitz. He's not very clear in the painting. He appears a bit like a sooty blob, but in the engraved version, he's much more visible. Rover's adventures in Europe included getting lost in Paris. He enjoyed peering over the precipices in the Alps whilst his master was cowering with vertigo. He chased carriages, he was attacked by other dogs, and he even broke a leg in Florence. And for a while, the Earl left Rover with his leg set in the care of the Queen of Naples. And at one point, he even jokingly talked about commissioning the great artist Pompeo Bertoni to paint Rover's portrait. Now, the Earl may have returned to England at the end of 1769 with carriage loads of art treasures, but alas, one thing he did not return with was Rover. Homeward bound, he met his end in Paris, crossing one boulevard too many, and was flattened by a coach, leaving the Earl heartbroken. Another spirited tourist was the Fifth Earl's daughter Caroline, who later became Lady Cawdor, seen here in a glamorous miniature by François Ferrier. In 1814, aged 44, she and her husband set out for the continent, and she left a wonderfully vivid and opinionated account of foreign travel. The opening alone, describing her landing in France, signals the quality and tone of her writing. The ceremony of landing at Calais at low water is by no means agreeable. Before your boat comes near the shore, it is surrounded by a parcel of absolute savages, jabbering some strange dialect and fighting for who shall seize upon you at first, and then perforce they tear you out of your boat and, wading with you through deep water for a considerable way, at last deposit you upon some very wet sand. After journeying through France, the couple crossed the Alps and travelled down the Italian peninsula through Turin, Milan, Bologna, Florence, and Rome. Lady Cawdor regularly complained about the conditions of the inns they stayed in. She quarrelled with locals and with the postilions who drove their carriage. And she took with her a nécessaire, similar to this, perhaps, a travelling tea set, and whenever she had established herself in her new lodgings, she would make tea for herself and guests. In Rome, she met the great sculptor Canova, visited the Pope at his summer palace, and particularly enjoyed walking inside the ruins of the Colosseum. She and her husband then moved on to Naples, where they visited the famous grotto at Posillipo, climbed Mount Vesuvius, and visited the stupendous palace at Caserta, boasting more than 1,000 rooms. It was during this journey that news reached them of Napoleon's escape from Elba and the start of his last attempt to dominate Europe, known as the 100 Days, which ended at the Battle of Waterloo. Military preparations threw the continent into turmoil, but the Cawdors remained largely unmoved by these events and chose not to cut their tour short, as did many English travellers. However, they decided to return through Switzerland. And in May 1815, joy at the news of Napoleon's defeat was quickly followed by sorrow on learning that her brother Frederick had been killed at Waterloo. As the couple reached Paris, they found it filled with Allied troops, Germans, Belgians, Russians, and of course English soldiers, all encamped in the boulevards and gardens of the city.
The link between Castle Howard and Italy continued in the 19th century, but in a slightly different way to the century before. Here is George Howard, the 9th Earl of Carlisle, who, as we can see, was an artist in his own right. And he would travel to Italy repeatedly from the 1860s onwards, mainly to paint landscapes in oil or in watercolour. But he would also study the great works of architecture, sculpture and painting, which would be inspirations for his own work. So his motives weren't the same as those of his ancestors, who travelled to collect great art treasures. In fact, one of the Ninth Earl's sketches pokes fun at the whole idea of the Grand Tour and turns on its head the idea of serious collecting.
His love of English scenery was lifelong, and his repeated visits to Italy were captured mainly in watercolours, such as this view in the bottom left of the coast at Amalfi, but also studies of local life. So here we have a young girl on a path near Anelia. By the 1880s, the Earl was venturing further afield, and in 1888 made the first of 3 trips to Egypt, accompanied by his wife and 5 of his children. They sailed up the Nile, stopping at Luxor, where he began a series of views of landscapes and temples. And his sketchbooks show how his work progressed from quick pencil outlines with a few highlights towards finished oils or watercolours. And later he travelled further afield to India, South Africa during the Boer War, and to the West Indies. Just as revealing and more amusing are his pictorial records of family holidays. These are from a sketchbook. Seen here on the left, we have the family accompanying the Earl on a picnic whilst he paints distant ruins. Or on the right, a very humorous depiction of the everyday perils of travel with a large family and masses of luggage. At the top of this right-hand image, you have his son Charlie wrestling with the straps for some of their valises and cases. And on the bottom of that picture, there's a little inscription that says, "The fiddle in danger at Paris." There, the violin in its case is left on the platform with a porter and a heavily laden barrow rushing towards it, about to smash it to smithereens. And then there is in this album a mock-serious bird's-eye view of Italy, entitled Principal Objects of Interest and Value in That Country. At first, one might think this is a record of all the usual Grand Tour sights, impressions, and trophies. But look again, closely. In fact, this is a record of what the family left behind in Italy. Down in Pompeii was clearly a copy of a Baedeker left behind. There was a cap of some sort at Orvieto, a tunic at Siena, binoculars in Pisa, an hypodermic syringe in Padua, another book here in Bellinzona, and then, incredibly, a child, it seems, in Genoa. Their youngest son, Christopher, got lost in the city at one point. This wonderful drawing reverses all the logic of the Earl's ancestors, who'd noted down their acquisitions and where their purchases had been made in Italy. Here is a bizarre testament to the impact of Castle Howard leftovers on Italy. The late Christian Howard, recording how she grew up in the 1920s at Castle Howard, surrounded with paintings assembled from all over Europe, recalled how on her first visit to Italy as a young girl, she felt she knew the landscape already. It was familiar. Her impressions informed by the paintings made by her grandfather, the Ninth Earl, and other pictures in the house, especially the Venetian view paintings. And that is the point about a house like Castle Howard. As you wander around, you see everywhere the fruits of travel and touring. Purchases from abroad fill the house, much as they might do in a more modest way in our own homes. But as with the Earl's sketch of Italy, every traveller leaves something behind. If not their personal belongings, then a little bit of themselves that invariably acts as a magnet to draw them back again in the future.
These paintings that we've been looking at are passports. They're gateways into places distant in space and time, far, far away from Castle Howard. Through them, for example, one can visit 18th century Venice or the ruins of ancient Rome. without actually having to leave home. They are mementos from the Grand Tour, but they've also become lifelong companions, part of a collection hanging here on the walls at home, and capable of giving the viewer instruction and pleasure. Every time you stop in front of one of these pictures and stare at them, there's the potential to be transported somewhere else. We take this notion for granted today, when the internet means that we can go anywhere with a few strokes of the keyboard. And it's something we appreciate even more during this period of restricted travel. But these paintings demonstrate that virtual travel was around long before the digital age. Looking at an individual painting, a watercolour, a sketch, an engraving would have been the next best thing to travelling there in person and seeing the site at first hand. And if we really are facing a world of diminished horizons in the foreseeable future, then these paintings are reminders of how we can immerse ourselves into distant places through the power of art. These pictures have many things to say. Who painted them, the significance of the scenes depicted, how they were acquired, how they were transported back to Yorkshire, displayed on the walls of the house, and indeed their impact on the viewer. Not just generations of the Howard family, but the visitor to the house today. That these pictures tease out memories and associations from your own travels. Can you place yourself in these locations, in Rome or in Venice? Indeed, how would you choose to go to Rome or Venice today? Would your journey be a physical one, or would it be a virtual one?
Travel is a subtle and complicated experience. There is what you see, often measured against what you expect to see. Are you pleased or dissatisfied? Is the real thing better than anticipated, or a letdown? And sightseeing is always invested with a heady mix of place, language, and other unfamiliar sensations. Travel is both voyaging and what you bring back with you. Memories, trophies, written accounts. And it's also that sense of elsewhere that lingers in your mind, often luring you to return. We haven't crossed any border control on this tour today, but we've journeyed far and wide. Before long, we look forward to welcoming you to join us at Castle Howard on your own journey, where you will be able to visit the house and enjoy these treasures firsthand and learn even more about them. In the meantime, I hope this virtual journey has been worthwhile.